Hello everyone. Back in January, I made a goal for myself. I vowed that I will have a published game in 2024. I can proudly say that I have been working towards that goal. Even if there were some times I wasn't pushing as hard as I could have, I was still making progress nonetheless, slowly but surely. I've been seeing a lot of devlog videos on YouTube from so many creative and talented individuals, and it's been keeping me motivated. Seeing their progress gives me hope that I'll be able to get to the point that they're at, all while seeing where it started and where it is now. I won't lie, because I also feel a little bit discouraged because I can't help but compare the things that they can do to what I can't. And I know that's not the best way to look at things, but I do have those thoughts sometimes. But really, I just have to keep working at it. Practice makes perfect, and you won't know unless you try. So here I am, trying and hoping I can make something I can be proud of. With this first devlog, I'm going to be reviewing the mechanics I created for my upcoming third-person action-adventure game. Again, I'm proud to say that I've been working at this consistently and I'm moving in the right direction. Soon, I'll be able to create a gameplay loop to really see if my ideas work well together. My plan was to have a total of 4 sprints throughout the months of January and February. For the first week, the goal was to get mechanics created. I needed the 2 main characters in the game and a way to switch between them. By the way, the main character's name is Cole, and he has the unique ability to manipulate his shadow to do things like teleport to other shadows, shoot shadow bullets, and attach to shadow surfaces to do things like climb up walls. His name is Shadow, which is right on the nose. The overall goal is to make the movement fun and fluid so the player can dodge projectiles like a bullet hell game. During the first 2 weeks, I sat down and got to work. I already had the Unity starter asset character controller in the project, so I reskinned it to a black material and added a particle effect to make it look mystical. The original character controller would be our main character Cole, and the other will be his shadow. The next thing was to make a way to switch between the two. I spent some time figuring out how I wanted to change between the characters and decided to toggle on and off the characters depending on who the player wants to switch to. But there was one issue. They weren't spawning on top of each other, and I was having trouble figuring out the best way to make that happen. So by the end of this sprint, I didn't finish it and decided to just move it to the next sprint. I ended up finishing the sprint with a bunch of tasks unfinished, which ended up getting moved over to sprint number 2. The sprint goal this time is the same as the last one. I didn't get time to focus on how the player was moving and getting around, so for this sprint, I ended up working on the things I thought would be the most important. Of course, I ended up finishing the character switch mechanic, and now they spawn on top of each other. The next thing I wanted to work on was a special ability that Shadow has, the Lurk ability. While in the Lurk ability, Shadow will have increased movement speed and the ability to latch to shadow surfaces. For this task, I ended up making another character controller from the starter asset pack, and this time it toggles between the shadow form and the lurk form. Next was the teleport mechanic. As mentioned before, Shadow can teleport to other shadows. This feature is utilized by all forms. Cole is able to teleport because he's able to move to Shadow at any given time, so think of Shadow as the catalyst of this ability. For this mechanic, I followed a YouTube tutorial on how to make a teleportation system in Unity. I spent a lot of the time just messing around with making it feel natural. There are 2 versions of teleporting, so I can choose between teleporting to fixed points or teleporting freely in a designated area. The next thing I worked on was the health mechanic. At first, I tested out a health system and didn't like it, so I ended up just using the Brachy's health system. I made a super easy health bar, and that was the end of the sprint. I ended up not working on the project for a little bit, and then got back to it with sprint number 3. During this sprint, some of the tasks from the previous sprint made it over to this one, mainly because I wasn't working as hard as I was during that week, so I had some big goals for the next sprint. I had just finished one of the biggest hurdles I was having while working on the game. There was an issue while switching between Cole and Shadow and from Shadow to his lurk ability, but I'll get to that in a little bit. I had a new goal for this sprint. Since I was able to get movement into the game and had a health system, I would add obstacles to the game. By the end of the sprint, I wanted hazards the player will have to avoid, basic targets that shoot projectiles at the player, and the player to have to dodge them and shoot the targets to defeat them. The first thing I did was create shadow spikes that come out of the ground. While working on this, I wasn't sure how complex it was going to be to get the spikes to come out of the ground, but making it was super simple. I just created an animation that indicates that spikes are about to pop out, and a couple of seconds later, they emerge from the ground and retract right back into it. If the player is on top of the spikes, or if they run through them, they will take damage. I also wanted to fix some of the issues I was having with the mechanics I already implemented. First off, when the player switches to Shadow on the Shadow area and leaves the Shadow area, he doesn't switch back to Cole. Fixing this bug wasn't too hard because I had looked into fixing this when I initially made the mechanic, but I didn't save any of the changes and they got lost. So I basically retraced my steps, and now there's a physics cube that checks if the player is in a Shadow area, and as soon as it detects that Shadow isn't in the area, it switches back to Cole. Next, when switching characters or switching to the lurk ability, the character controller keeps moving in the position that was last input. Now, whenever you're moving with any character and you switch while moving, the next time you switch back to the previous character, they won't be moving on their own. Next, I wanted to change how the player shoots. Basically, I'm trying to do something similar to Nier Replicant and Nier Automata, like how Vice and the pods hover to the side of the character and follow them around and shoot the bullets. I want to change it so that when the player is aiming, a shadow blob hovers next to the player and the bullets will come out of it. Some things to consider is the reason it would be shooting out of a shadow blob is because Cole is a human and can't just produce shadows out of thin air. So he'll have to use a catalyst to shoot. In this case, the catalyst would be Shadow. If playing as Shadow, I kinda want the bullets to just come out of his hands because he is a Shadow, and this would be the same for when he's in his lurk state. So if Shadow is the catalyst for the bullets, then he would be able to produce them out of his body. So I ended up getting a little ambitious with my goal, and instead of just having basic targets that shoot projectiles, I decided to make a basic enemy. I came up with the idea of having different enemy types. This is fleshed out in my game design document. The shadow enemies are called shades. They are the manifestation of anything with pain, negative emotions, etc. There will be enemy types that range from basic enemies to bosses. There will also be human enemies such as security guards, thugs, etc. The basic enemies are called drags and jinxes. These are the manifestation of people who are just having a bad day and will be good for quick skill points. There will be many that spawn in. They're not too much of a threat, more so just a nuisance. These can take on the form of anything, but they're usually small little ankle biters. These enemies like to gather around powerful shades because they like seeing people who have it worse off than them. Drags are small, slow, and weak. They need to be close to the player to do an attack, and they don't have any special moves. So, I worked on creating basic enemies that patrol so it moves around the level, follows the player, and shoots or melees the player. I made the drag a small shadow blob. I also created a hopping animation for when the drag is moving and attacking. I only had a little bit of a hiccup trying to figure out how to create the animations and implement them, but I managed to find a way by creating an animation controller script to focus on the animation and making the enemy script control the functionality for things like the nav mesh. For the next basic enemy, I wanted to do something different with the Jinx. I wanted these enemies to fly around, but figuring it out was a little bit annoying, so I ended up just making them walking enemies that are taller than the drags and they shoot projectiles. I also thought it would be kinda cool to make them go crazy whenever they're attacking the player. And now, the final meat and potatoes of what had been taking up a lot of my time and energy throughout the sprints. I, for the life of me, could not figure out how to fix this, but I kept coming back and figuring things out little by little. Is it game breaking? Not necessarily. Will it impact the fun of the game? Yes. So what am I talking about? The camera. I was trying to get the camera to stay in the same position that the player is looking, but every time I switched characters, the camera snaps back to the position it was before. Even when I tried to change the position through code, it jumped back. I wasn't sure why and I didn't know where to look, but I was working on fixing this throughout each sprint and I had to shelf the issue and come back to it later. Then, finally, I managed to figure out the issue with the camera and get it to work the way I wanted it to. I just wanted the camera to look the same way the player was looking when they switched, so it wouldn't be jarring and so they wouldn't have to adjust the camera angle every single time. Now that it's working as intended, I can focus on making other aspects of the game and testing will be easier because of it. Now that every task I plan to work on is done, I can start putting together a gameplay loop which will be the focus of the next sprint. Or so I thought. So, it turns out during sprint number 3, I had COVID, so around the time I started working on everything, I was just starting to get sick. So I said that by the end of February, I would have a bullet hell third-person shooter game. I would say that I technically have the groundwork for making something like that, but I didn't really get to make a full level that shows it off. On account of me having COVID, that put a full stop to the momentum I had going. Sprint number 4 was a bit weird and didn't have a lot of clear direction because of how hard it was for me to get up and properly plan my tasks. So I kinda just worked on whatever I wanted to. I don't have a gameplay loop, but I decided to look into creating an intro for my game. This includes messing around with Cinemachine and the timeline to create cutscenes and creating an environment for the player to start in. The idea behind the beginning of the game is that we're starting off in the Shadow Dimension, which is a hazardous, dangerous place where all the shadows live and where we're introduced to our main characters at a young age. This is where the gameplay would start, which gives me a lot to work on for my next set of tasks. I'm going to share what I have so far, and this is an early version of the vision that I have for the start of my game. I think it looks pretty cool, and I think it would look even cooler with finished assets and animations, but let me know what you think.